Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the General Committee on Public Policy Road to the Midterms series. I am Brother Dr. Leonard C. McInnes II, and I have the privilege of serving as your General Chairman on the Committee on Public Policy. Brothers and guests, this series is our opportunity to engage the most pressing issues facing our community as we prepare for the November midterms. This series happens every second Wednesday. From now until November, we will be presenting issues from housing to education to religion to all sorts of matters that affect the communities that we serve as an organization. Do us a favor, those of you who have joined, and we have a nice crowd that's already joined. Thank you so very much. Do us a favor, share it. Like it, share it to your friends, share it to your groups, share it to your networks so they can be a part of this conversation that we are engaged in tonight. And I am so very pleased to have one of the members of this committee, Brother James Williams, who will be moderating the discussion this evening. I want to introduce Brother Williams and then give him the floor to bring his panelists on board. So bear with me for a minute while I introduce our moderator for tonight's conversation. Brother James C. Williams IV is a Spring 04 initiate by way of Epsilon Zeta chapter, seated at Fayetteville State University, Fayetteville State, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Brother Williams graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and went on to obtain his Master's of Science in Criminal Justice. He was Director of Racial Justice Policy with the Fair Share Housing Center of New Jersey. In this capacity, he plays a leadership role in charting the next generation of state and national policy to address critical issues of racial justice, fair housing, climate change, and disaster recovery, coordinating those efforts and that work in this area, and collaborating with a diverse range of other groups at the state level and nationally. Brother Williams has served in several capacities within our dear fraternity, to include chapter vice president at the college and the alumni level, associate area director, chief dean, and others. During his time in Alpha, Brother Williams has remained active in Alpha South, Midwest, East, and West. He is the current executive director for the New Jersey, as Alpha Associations. It is the New Jersey chapters of Alpha Phi Alpha, and he will soon join me in the peer of ranks as a district director who will serve as the 14th district director of the New Jersey area. I'm so proud to introduce a fellow member of the committee, the General Committee on Public Policy, and soon to be welcomed into the ranks of the district directors, my dear brother, Brother James Williams. Brother Williams.
Thank you, dear brother. Thank you. That was a very, very heartfelt introduction. I'm really looking forward to this conversation and bringing forth the topic for the evening. April is Fair Housing Month. And as we deliberated on topics that we should bring forth as the Public Policy Committee, we thought that housing and the difficulties that we still face today, and thus the framing 1968, the quest for fair housing continues. So we've put together, I believe, an amazing panel that is going to bring us a diverse group of perspectives on how we can elevate these issues, and we're going to have a really, really robust conversation. So I'm looking forward to having the panelists come forth so we can get started with tonight's conversation.
So, Brother Williams, real quick, I'm not sure, we have a lot of people in the backstage. So I'm not sure how they got the link to this, but you want to give me the names of the panelists I should be letting to the stage?
That was probably my area. So Catherine Buell.
One second. Catherine Buell.
Yes. Thaisa Kelly.
Got her. And Brother Toussaint.
Yes. And I think everyone else, that was my fault. I think I was sending the flyer and the link. I had it all attached together, and everyone's saying it's full, so they just need to get moved over to the general audience. So, my panelists, thank you all so much for taking time out of your evening to join me on this conversation which we framed 1968 continues the quest for fair housing. So I'm going to allow each and every one of you to make some small and brief introductions, and then we'll throw some questions out and have a conversation. So, Brother Dr. Etienne Toussaint, if you don't mind giving us a brief introduction of who you are, your background, and then and we'll make our round to the other panelists.
Sure. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Etienne Toussaint. I'm currently a law professor at the University of South Carolina, Joseph F. Rice School of Law. I'm a private law scholar where I examine dominant cultural values and assumptions embedded in private law and how they sustain economic and social hierarchies. And I also explore how imaginative and historical perspectives from marginalized communities can help reimagine law and political economy toward more liberatory ends. I teach business law courses currently. I previously, at my prior institution, was a director of a community development law clinic, where in Washington, D.C., I did cooperative housing development work. I have a law degree from Harvard Law School and a master's from Johns Hopkins in engineering and also from MIT. I joined Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated through the Rho Nu chapter in Cambridge, Massachusetts, also when I was an undergraduate student at MIT in the spring of 2004. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation.
My Sands, Jonathan White says he says hello. He told me to give you greetings. Thaisa.
Good evening. It's nice to be here with all of you. Hi, again, my name is Thaisa Kelly. I'm CEO of Monarch Housing Associates. Monarch Housing Associates is a nonprofit organization in New Jersey that has been doing work to address housing needs in the state. We're an organization that believes every person deserves safe, stable housing. So we do that work to try to ensure that all residents of New Jersey have access to the housing that they need. And this includes doing work to address and end homelessness within the state, and also doing work with developers to create affordable and supportive housing that meets the needs of various populations. Embedded within this work for us are two things. One, really thinking about how do we ensure there's equity, not only in the type of housing that's built, but also in who's building housing within the state. And two, at the foundation of it all really is the belief that housing is a human right and that we have to ensure that everybody has access to housing because it is what we all deserve as human beings. And definitely as residents of New Jersey and as people within this country. So that's a little bit about Monarch, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And my last panelist, I was saying this earlier, I don't often get the opportunity to call her by her first name, but my Aunt Kathy. So for you wonder how I got my traction in this space. So I come from good stock. So Catherine, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Well, it is an honor to be on this panel. It's an honor to be amongst all of you. So my name is Catherine Buell, and I run a boutique real estate firm called Wellness Real Estate Innovations. I consider myself a startup kid and have served in a number of roles in the housing and community development space, from chairing the District of Columbia's Historic Preservation Review Board, which is how I first got introduced into real estate, to running a major redevelopment project here in Washington, D.C. called St. Elizabeth's, to running the Atlanta Housing Authority, which is one of the foremost housing authorities in the country, serving over 24,000 families in the city of Atlanta. Most recently, my claim to fame has been creating and launching the Amazon Housing Equity Fund, which at the time when I launched it was a $2 billion commitment to creating or preserving 20,000 affordable homes across 3 U.S. metropolitan regions. It did just that. It claimed success in 2024, actually investing in over 21,000 homes, if you can believe it, in less than 3 years. And it shows that cheap capital can really move the housing market. That made me a believer. And so I decided to use the power of creation, my knowledge of the housing field to really enter into something new. And there's an emerging market called wellness real estate, and it is primarily focused on high-end real estate products in the luxury market. Think hotels that are highly amenitized, senior villages that focus on wellness, to communities. Actual communities are being built so that they can be walkable, they can be green, and they can really enhance your well-being. And our firm is focused on bringing those health and housing solutions to more urbanized areas. So it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Thank you so much. So, Professor, Dr. Brother Toussaint, I'm going to start with you. So, you and I, we had a good conversation about ways that you could elevate your academic and your practical practice into this conversation, and thought about some questions for you. And I'll throw this one out to you just to start off. So, how do structural inequities in urban housing continue to affect access to affordable homes, and what legal or policy tools can we help to address these gaps?
Yeah, thank you again for having me. And I really appreciate that question, because I think it provides us with an opportunity to ground this conversation in a bit of history. Because the housing crisis that we're living through is not actually a market failure in the accidental sense, right? This is not a byproduct of a flawed marketplace based on current conditions, but it actually is a dilemma that was built deliberately, intentionally, and actually legally over decades. And we can go back in history and begin with redlining, go back to the Jim Crow era, 1930s, where the Homeowners Loan Corporation created maps where they colored Black and immigrant neighborhoods red, meaning that those neighborhoods were hazardous for investment, hence the term redlining. And if you lay that over a current map of concentrated poverty in that same city, you'd often see a near perfect overlap, which means that these issues have persisted across generations in terms of the concentration of poverty and racial segregation. So just that fact alone provides us with an indication that this isn't coincidence. This is actually a byproduct of historic policy and law, which in many ways therefore makes this a part of our nation's legal history. We can also think about racially restrictive covenants historically that barred Black families from buying and appreciating neighborhoods, federal mortgage insurance that subsidized white suburbanization, while refusing to back loans in urban communities of color. And of course, many of us are familiar with the concept of urban renewal that demolished historic Black communities in many urban centers across the country under the banner of blight clearance, right? This happened even in my own neighborhood of the South Bronx. Each mechanism was justified by law, and each one compounded the issues that preceded it. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made discrimination in housing illegal, moving beyond that point. And that's important, but prohibiting discrimination in the future does not remediate the structural issues that manifested across decades through a discriminatory past. So what is required is affirmative remediation, and that is precisely what the law has struggled to achieve. In terms of the legal and policy tools that you asked about that I think are worth discussing, first, I think we need to enforce what already exists. So the Fair Housing Act includes an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, which means beyond simply not discriminating, there is actually a mandate for states that are receiving federal dollars from HUD to desegregate their housing stock. Of course, there has been a lot of pushback against this over the generations and decades since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. The rule was formalized by HUD in 2015, but even in the past decade since then, it has been debated, suspended, reinstated, and weakened, most recently, right under the Trump administration. So that level of volatility is one argument for codifying that principle in law, in statute, rather than leaving it to the whims of executive discretion. The second layer that I think is important for us to talk about and think about is exclusionary zoning and the need to reform that practice. Roughly 75% of residential land in the United States is zoned for single family housing. And that is a policy choice that has historical ramifications and economic consequences. However, California, Oregon, Montana, these are states, among others, that have passed laws to try to address this issue. And so the evidence is building that reform that addresses exclusionary zoning is among some of the ways to promote fair housing and to address the concentration of poverty, both economically and racially. The final layer that I think is important to think about, but to think about strategically, that goes beyond discrimination, is to actively build wealth in communities that were stripped of it, and to do so in a way that challenges the conventional logics of our marketplace, which is to build community collective power and collective wealth. And some strategies that do that are community land trust, cooperative housing, community benefit agreements. These are mechanisms that think about community collectively and not housing as an individual enterprise, which often makes it difficult, if not impossible, for low-income communities to compete in an increasingly competitive marketplace. So ultimately, I think what we see is that while anti-discrimination was and remains an important element of this issue, it is not sufficient alone, right? The next generation of fair housing work is really about structural remedies that will remove barriers to access, build community ownership, build collective power, and provide communities with the resources and tools that they need in a marketplace and in a legal regime that was never built with them in mind.
Thank you so much, good brother. That was a wow. There were a lot of gems to take away from there. But I'm not going to belabor and get to our next panelist. Thaisa, we've worked together for years, and I think Professor Toussaint's response rings true to a lot of the work that we're doing here in the state. He touched on a lot of the things that you and I are currently working on. So give you a great one to knock out the park. I think the buckets of work that you're currently working on in housing as a human right will be a great way of caveating from what Professor Toussaint just lifted up. So I'll tell us some about that housing as a human right, and more importantly, just tying back to some of those policy and structural remedies that Professor Toussaint just lifted up.
Sure, thank you for that. And yeah, I want to echo all of the things that Professor Toussaint really highlighted, point to the idea that the place that we are in right now, with housing being unaffordable, with increases in homelessness, with homelessness disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities, that fact is a result of policy and practice that has been years and years, hundreds of years in the making. And so the way that we address it is by reframing the policies and approaches that we have in our country around housing. Part of that conversation is about really rethinking what we mean when we say, what is housing? What place does housing serve in our nation, in our communities, and for us as individuals, as human beings? We have been working at Monarch to really kind of reframe the narrative around housing. Oftentimes when people are thinking about housing, they're thinking about it from an economic standpoint. It is a vehicle for increasing generational wealth, and it has done that for some populations in our country. And it has also been a vehicle for removing wealth from communities, and especially Black and Brown communities. So oftentimes we have been, when we're talking about housing today, it is really more from a perspective of wealth and wealth building. It is a vehicle to earn, to grow from. But at the core, housing is much bigger than that. Housing is connected to our ability to have access to good educational systems. It's connected to our health. It's connected to our economic opportunities. It is connected to just our general ability to thrive and our ability to imagine more for ourselves. And so if we think about housing from that perspective, it is really foundational to us as human beings and our ability to thrive and to grow and to reimagine our lives. That is a very different concept than the idea of housing as an economic engine for our, economic growth. So what we've been really thinking about is how can we reframe this conversation around housing to recognize that every single person, if you are alive and breathing, you need housing that meets your needs in order for you to live your best life. If we work from perspective, then everybody should have housing, just like we understand everybody needs air to breathe, everybody needs food to eat, everybody needs water to drink. We also have to understand and accept that everybody needs housing to thrive. So this conversation around housing as a human right for us really is about rethinking the role that housing plays and the way that we think about housing, and then translating that into policy. As James mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work in New Jersey that touches on really kind of reversing some of the historical practices and historical challenges that the way that housing has been used to segregate and to keep down Black and Brown communities. We've been really working to reverse some of those things in New Jersey through proactive policies that really ensure that we have housing that meets everybody's needs, and that is coming through in our fair housing laws in the state. The challenges we've had great success in passing really, really progressive fair housing laws in New Jersey, where we have a place where every community is required to build their fair share of affordable housing to ensure that they have the opportunity for every person to live in their community. But we continue to have this fight, despite the fact that we have this law, we continue to have fights daily around how that is operationalized. And those fights are rooted in a resistance to the idea that everybody deserves housing. So that brings us back again to this narrative of housing as a human right. When we talk about housing as a human right, we talk about it really meaning that we have to address access to housing and the barriers that people face in actually getting into housing and ending homelessness. We have to address stability in housing, ensuring that people, once they get into housing, can remain in that housing that meets their needs. And then we also have to address production of housing and ensuring that we're continuing to keep up with the demand and meet the needs of housing and build the housing that we need in our communities that fit the lifestyles that people have. Oftentimes when we're talking about housing in New Jersey and we're talking about creating affordable housing in our state, the rhetoric we hear about why that's not something that communities want to move forward with is that they don't want to change the character of their community. The challenge is that our country is growing, our communities are changing. The ways our communities look change, the needs of the population in our communities change, our housing has to change with it. We can't expect the housing that was built in 1950s to meet the needs of the population today. So we have to be prepared for our housing production to change with the needs of the community. We have to make sure that people have access to that housing, and we have to make sure that people can stay in that housing once they get in. If we're addressing all of those three key areas, really moving towards a place where housing is understood as a human right, and we can truly begin to say that we recognize that housing is a human right, and we're operationalizing that in our policies and our practices. So that's what we're really working towards in New Jersey, and hopefully can start to move towards as a country.
Excellent. So, Catherine, so you and I, obviously, we talk, and you've been in your career, you've had an opportunity to move through as a practitioner, and now you've become your own boutique think tank, and having had an opportunity to kind of step away from the housing space and really think about new innovations and ways that you can address some of the things that you've worked on for so many years at such a high level. So what are some of the new innovations and thoughts that if you don't mind sharing, that you and I have discussed about ways that we can address some of the inequities that Thaisa and Professor Toussaint have lifted up?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say amen to everything that was said before me. The fact that we can't build the housing where we need to build it, the fact that resources are being taken away, the fact that there's a homelessness problem and it's growing and it's largely affecting communities of color because there are barriers to building the kind of housing, including mainly multifamily housing, that would allow more people of color to live in different neighborhoods, are a reality that we live in. I come at this from a very different perspective, and mine is one that has been blessed to be able to work on many of those battles. Housing authorities across this country are essential, and they need to be supported and they need to be resourced because so many of them support those who need to make sure that they have at least essential basic housing. But when I stepped away from Amazon, and what was magical about Amazon and the Housing Equity Fund is you saw what dynamic capital could do in a market. The fact that it could really co-fund thousands of units in a metropolitan region and see housing grow in areas where, quite frankly, a lot of those barriers were non-issues. We could go into more affluent neighborhoods. We ended up focusing partially on existing properties. So a lot of the properties that we helped nonprofit and for-profit developers go in and convert into affordable housing were existing buildings. And so people didn't have the battles around the character of the neighborhood. And so we kind of snuck in through the back door, if you will. We also paid attention to who we were investing in when I was there, and made sure that developers of color were also part of the solution. So it's not just funding housing for communities of color, but it's making sure that the people who are developing that housing reflected them. That being said, when I stepped away, I did a fellowship at Harvard, and I came across some data that I just simply could not unsee. And it was around the shift in aging that is happening in our country, that 1 in 5 Americans is soon to be over the age of 65, that there is a loneliness epidemic. And for African Americans, this is going to really take us under. African Americans are more likely to live alone than any other demographic in the United States at every age and stage of our lives. So New York Times did this beautiful article in 2023 that I just grasped onto, and this pretty little chart showed how the loneliness epidemic was impacting people across demographics. And what it found is that white families were more likely to get married. Latino and Hispanic and Asian families were more likely to live in multi-generational housing, and that African Americans, we tended to live alone. Why would the housing person be so concerned with that? Because what that means is that as we start to age, we're not going to have the resources to be able to live in the kinds of communities that we want to live in. We're not going to have the resources to be able to make sure that we have the kind of housing that we want to live in. And particularly when you couple in health issues with that, with what we're dealing with for African American communities, this is going to be a way to take away a significant portion of our wealth if we are not thoughtful and we do not plan for it. In many jurisdictions, the homeless population is actually increasing, not because people are finding themselves more out of work necessarily, not because people are finding themselves more addicted. It's because elders in our community are on fixed incomes on Social Security, and they just simply can't afford to live anywhere else because we're not building the kind of housing that they can actually afford. Right? Zoning laws don't allow co-housing in single family neighborhoods. And so we're just not having this discussion, and we're not having this discussion within our community. Why do I raise this issue? Because the bulk of my work is done in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is an interesting test case because 59% of D.C.'s elder population are women, 55% are African American. And close to 50% of DC elders, 50 to 60%, own their homes. So this means that a lot of the wealth that so many people have fought for us to have is going to be lost if we don't have some sort of alternative solution. And having grandma age in place and maintain and spend all of her retirement savings maintaining an old house that requires her to go up and down the stairs isn't going to cut it. And so my firm is really focused on, okay, so what's next? There have been a lot of people investing in affordable housing, and that work still needs to continue. We still need to fund homeless service providers, But we also need to start thinking about what this shift means. And due to the fact that half of the 5-year-olds who are born today are going to live until they're 100, there are going to be more and more elders in our community. People are not having babies, and to the extent there are babies, those are babies of color. And so that means that it's a lot of us who are going to be in the room who are going to be impacted by what is built for the future. And so when I start looking at innovations, I start thinking about, okay, so what needs to be built? One of the big projects that I'm most excited about is a dementia village. In a lot of African-American spaces, we have the worst health outcomes. So no surprise that in a place like Washington, D.C., we actually have the highest rates of dementia in the country, but we have zero housing for those with memory loss. Most of our loved ones have to move into nursing homes, which are absolutely the worst environment or one of the worst that you can put your loved ones in, because it's startling. There is a better model. So how do we start to create better models for those who need health supported housing? We're also looking at intergenerational communities near HBCUs. How do we start thinking about how to make sure that we're merging the ages, because people don't necessarily want to be age segregated, in places that are more dynamic? And how do we actually build out those kind of wellness, walkable communities in unique spaces? And so for me, the future is thinking outside the box. How do we start to build intentionally designed multi-generational housing? How do we bring online family opportunity mortgages that allow you to buy a house leveraging your parents' equity that they've been able to build up, that is not enough for them to go buy a new house, but when combined with your income, could allow you to buy a large multi-generational house? So really thinking about, okay, yes, we do need to invest in more multifamily housing, but what is that next wave that we need to be thinking about?
As you can see, I am not the brains of my family. I get it honestly. So thank you, Catherine, for that. Wow, so many gems, so many things to take away. I was torn. I was like, you started, talking about the homelessness population, and Thais has done tremendous work there. And then you talked about diversifying and building more dynamic communities. So I'm gonna keep it equitable. I'm gonna shift back to Professor Toussaint and just think about cooperative housing models, right? So there are some places that are able to do that very well. Some places in the country that haven't got it quite right in its way of becoming an economic driver and a way of growing and to Catherine's point, kind of creating dynamic communities. So give us your thoughts on how that can be a tool, and how some states could better utilize that option if they haven't been able to get it done right. You're muted, good brother.
Thank you. Two concepts that emerge from what both Taisha and Catherine said. One is that, we often frame housing as an affordability issue. And so that enables us to see those who are unhoused or low income as the problem, right? And to think about solutions focused on providing those individual people with resources like vouchers, tax credits, giving them access to income restricted units that stay affordable. But all of these strategies focus on housing as an individual issue, which I think speaks to something that Catherine raised. We tend to think about cooperative and community controlled models as niche because they contradict this culture of individualism that sits at the root of the so-called American dream, this idea that each individual person should own a home. And as Catherine mentioned, this is driving in our modern day and age this loneliness epidemic, as she stated. But there is evidence to suggest that cooperative and community-controlled models are a real viable pathway forward. And it's not always about building wealth, but it's about building stability for people who are looking for community, and kind of speaks to this sense that Taisha raised, which is having a right to housing that is so critical to one's experience of citizenship and the ability to thrive. And so one question that I think cooperative and community controlled models ask that's different than affordability is, how do we remove housing from the speculative market altogether so that it remains permanently affordable? It can, in some cases, build equity for communities, but ultimately it allows housing stock to remain in the community to provide some sense of stability. And as I mentioned, the community land trust is a kind of community controlled legal framework that acquires land and holds it permanently for those within the community. From a structural standpoint, it leases the land to home buyers on a 99-year ground lease often, and the buyer owns the structure. But when they sell, there's a formula in the lease that limits appreciation enough to preserve affordability for the next buyer. And so it allows some equity to accumulate, but it's geared toward retaining affordability for the next generation. Certainly, we could talk about the downsides of that, right? In a capitalist economy where, as Taisha mentioned, many people view housing as an income generating mechanism. And so when we have structures like limited equity housing cooperatives, which is the framework that the Washington, D.C. Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act uses, and I'll mention what that is in a moment, right? It does raise some concerns about allowing members of the community to build equity and wealth through housing. But at the same time, it really is addressing that issue of stability and allowing those members to remain in a community that's rapidly gentrifying. So community land trusts are a model. As I mentioned, in Washington, D.C., there's a law called TOPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which I was involved with, which Catherine mentioned earlier, and how that works. And it's really an interesting model for the nation to take a look at. Residents form a tenants association. They have a first right of refusal when the landlord is seeking to sell the building. And via assistance from the government, they're able to purchase the building collectively as a cooperative association. So they collectively own the building through a business entity. And there are equity caps in place to preserve affordability, but it allows this community-based organization to own the building collectively, to manage it collectively, and to remain, which in many communities is providing the aging population with a mechanism to remain in a city that is growing increasingly expensive. And again, as I mentioned, there are some wealth building elements of these programs, but what I think is most important is it provides stability, right? Especially when we talk about rapid changes in the marketplace. The evidence shows that cooperatively owned units are able to weather the storm during moments like the 2008 financial crisis. For example, community land trust homes, cooperatively owned units fared much better, right, than single family homes in the marketplace because they were never leveraged in their loan structure in the same speculative way that you find with single family housing. On the policy side, as I mentioned in the beginning, these cooperative and community-owned structures are not as supported as they could. And so there is a lot of need for enabling legislation at the state level across the country so cooperative housing, community land trust can actually have the financing and funding to be created and to legally function and facilitate resale in the marketplace. In addition, there needs to be laws in place that enable community members to have that right of first refusal so that they can take advantage of the opportunity to work collectively and purchase the building via support from the city, as we see in Washington, D.C. So there are some progressive states that are increasingly creating these kinds of programs and providing funding to help community members come together and create that create community-based institutions that can address in a collective sense some of the housing challenges that we've raised. But in far too many cities, what we see is a lack of programming, a lack of legal frameworks to address housing. And in many jurisdictions, housing remains framed as an affordability issue. And so we see rising numbers of unhoused individuals, and their plight is viewed as an individual failing and not a structural issue.
And if I can just add to that, there are two groups that stand out that are doing community land trusts in a major way that are really exciting. So the Housing Fund in Nashville, Tennessee, run by Marsha Crawford, he actually has a shared equity program that is financed by the bank. He just bought a large plot of land with a number of additional nonprofits in Antioch, which is kind of the main African-American section part of town, where housing prices are going up. And what's fascinating about his community land trust models, they actually found that homeowners who were able to purchase under the shared equity program, they made just as much money as other homeowners who are purchasing in other parts of Nashville or other parts of that community. And so there wasn't an economic loss, which is a concern that most people have in this kind of instance. And he was doing it on the single family side. And so lifting up models like that, where the returns actually are being shown and proven to be equal to that of individual home ownership, are really important. There's also a group who's doing more of a shared living environment called Frolic, and they're operating in the Central District section of Seattle, Washington. They are a little different because they do allow you to share backyards, and there's one large kind of main big house where everybody lives together. And so it really depends on what culturally is appropriate for individuals, but there are some really exciting land trust models out there that are and have gotten some money, but they are hard to get off of the ground. I will just say in Washington, D.C., TOPA has been really hard because of the cost of multifamily housing for tenants to really engage in. And so finding those kind of sparks of hope, as I like to call it, is really important because it does show that these community land trust models work.
That is great. Thaisa, so Professor Toussaint he was really talking about that buzzword about stability, and you and I have talked about, you are a maverick when you always grin when you talk about regulating the housing market in New Jersey, and that usually turns a lot of people's heads a little sideways. What do you mean regulate the housing market? So if you don't mind expounding on some of your thoughts, because that usually it's a great pathway of innovation, but you and I work, we also work in the advocacy and the legislative engagement space. And that is that those two words, regulating the housing market, that phrase can, it can turn some legislators off. So this being a safe space, tell us some of your thoughts on how you'd like to see that housing market regulated so we can bring about more stability.
Right. And I guess first I want to start by saying our housing market is regulated. It's regulated in a way that doesn't benefit majority of people that look like us, but it is regulated. And our housing options and policies and processes are heavily regulated and create a framework where it is difficult for lower income households, where it is difficult for Black and brown households to actually move ahead in the housing market. So this concept of regulating the housing market is not new. It is not something that's foreign to us. It is something that we are actively doing. And I think what turns heads is when you start to talk about regulating in a way that creates equity. And that's really what we're trying to do when we're talking about regulating the housing market. So for us, when we're talking about regulating the housing market and actually creating stability, this includes looking at things like rent control, limits on amounts of rental increases, caps on the amounts of per year annual rental increases that landlords might charge. It looks at things like, limiting the use of tools that can help artificially increase the overall market cost and rents that are charged within a community. One piece I do want to just highlight, because, just pulling the thread from the conversations, and the comments earlier about, there's oftentimes the housing market is pitted as one around affordability, or one of kind of collective, one from I think as Etienne kind of framed this concept of focusing on affordability versus kind of community ownership and that type of framework. I do think that we have to get to a space where we are able to have a conversation about creating housing options, multiple housing options in the same community, and having the ability to hold all of those things at the same time, so that we are, one, addressing the affordability pieces, we have options and different processes and models that are in place to address affordability needs for households. And then also one that also looks at, how do we create cooperative models? How do we create home ownership models? How do we create models that also allow for people to increase their equity and to earn something economically from the housing market? Because at the end of the day, we still are residing in a capitalist economy. And that is something that is just the truth of where we are right now. So I think that there are ways for us to have policies that allow us to hold multiple things at one time. And it just requires us to be willing to make those changes and to recognize that a lot of this does lie in the laws and the practices that we employ around housing. The other piece I also want to just highlight when we're talking about regulating the housing space is that we do need to really start to talk about the policies and practices, the implementation of policy. Oftentimes what we see is that we have great policy, great intent, and often in New Jersey, we see that we have great intent in terms of policy initiatives. We have our Fair Chance in Housing law, which says that if you have a criminal background, that can't be held against you in your application for housing, and when landlords are evaluating you for housing. It is a great policy, but we also need to be looking at how it is being implemented, how it is being enforced, and making sure that we have processes and rules in place that actually speak to and support that policy and don't undermine it. And so we see that both in the stability space in terms of helping people to remain in housing. We see that in the access space in terms of the barriers people face to getting into housing. And we definitely see it in the production space in terms of program models that are intended to create housing products, but are really limiting in terms of the types of products that can be built and who can build those products. And that comes down to the regulatory framework that is used to actually implement those programs. So I do want to throw that into this conversation, that we also have to be willing to get into the conversation around regulation and the regulatory framework of implementing programs.
So, Kathy, you've talked about so many different things, and one piece I love when we talk, because you have this. You started at a very grassroots level, and we're talking about your work in Anacostia and how that kind of allowed you to move through the different iterations of your work. So tying it back to Professor Toussaint's work, when we talk about collective, that is not only just how you really build a community, and that came from you being an organizer, an advocate, and a galvanizer. So how did you find success in doing that in Anacostia, and how can we use those successes then in creating collective power to do some of the things that the three of you are discussing today?
That is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I actually began this journey. I was a corporate attorney who just liked reading all the studies and the reports, and I wondered what was going on. And I went to this exhibit at the Anacostia Community Museum, which is the only Smithsonian community museum in the country. And it was an exhibit on how federal housing administration loans that were given out at 0% interest to developers to develop kind of cheap multifamily housing really built out my side of the city. And I wanted to know why it was different. And I was like, oh, it's policy. That's what makes it different. And so what that meant is that it was really important for me to be in the room And for folks who are listening who want to make a difference, there are so many different roles. And I mean, you hear it in this conversation. Housing is not as simple. There is no one silver bullet. There's no one brilliant idea that is going to take the nation by storm. It is complex. It is truly an industry. And unfortunately, it is a heavily monetized industry at this point that is focused on individual wealth as opposed to collective benefits, if you will. What that means is that we need a lot of voices at the table. We need people showing up. We need people showing up at your community meetings. We need people supporting your local nonprofits and making sure you're staying abreast of what they're doing. We need people getting into the development field. What I found at Amazon is that the developers of color were doing some of the most creative projects that actually were going to have real impacts on diverse communities. And weren't just focused on the profits. They had very different priorities. And so from the community activism space, it's show up and play whatever role you can. And I've changed seats, I swear, 1 million different times, and I probably will a few more times, keep going around the bend. But it takes that in order to see the kind of shift that we need to make sure that we're in the conversation, because right now, the truth of the matter is people are struggling with how they're going to keep up their rent. I am shocked at where some of these rents are around the country. And it's not just affecting Black and brown people, even though sometimes that is what the media will tell you. It is an us issue. It is a we issue. It is affecting people up and down the income spectrum, white, Black, pink, and purple. But at the end of the day, there are specific issues that we're going to have to lean in on. And so from an activist point of view, lean in, figure out what your role is. It could be from the art side, it could be from the healthcare side, it could be from the housing side, but lean in, because we can't give up this fight just because people think that they're wearing us down.
Professor Toussaint, I want to pitch a question to you, and hopefully you don't mind. It's a little bit different than what you and I discussed, but I think you'll be able to address it. And Thais, I want to come back to you and talk about the work that you do with the BIPOC Developers Collaborative. But Professor Toussaint, one of the things we talk about, all the evolutionary things that we're seeing in these spaces, and one of those things are, how technology, i.e., AI algorithms, have been affecting housing, and particularly like access. So we talk about how it's become a discriminatory tool for places like Zillow and Realtor and things like that, how they're using it to, it's the new, to your earlier point, it's the new way of doing redlining, right? We're no longer doing it with a pen. We're just doing it through our computer. So what are your thoughts on that? How can we, you've made a lot of points about how we need to enact better policy. How can we insulate or protect the housing market against this new evolutionary tool that is AI and algorithmic bias in the housing market? You're muted again, good brother.
Sorry about that. That's an incredibly important question. And I want to connect it to something that Taisha mentioned earlier that I think is important, because oftentimes in conversations like this, we tend to focus on economics. And even as we raise the legal and policy dimensions through a historical lens, we tend to downplay the question of culture and how racism frames how we think about communities through a cultural lens, and ascribe stereotypes to different communities, and how that determines what we assume they're owed. It makes me think about Andrew Carnegie, who had a report in the early 20th century called The Gospel of Wealth, that put forward this notion that those who are wealthy deserve that wealth. And through a theological lens, he sort of justified that wealth and it was a lot of racial undertones to suggest that they have been called upon by God to help those who are poor, and those people are poor because that's their merit, right? That's what they deserve. We see that same concept emerge in the middle of the 20th century. Daniel Patrick Moynihan well-meaning, talks about this culture of poverty, and that framing is used to sort of explain why certain communities are poor, they lack access to housing that is affordable, and that cultural notion that some communities deserve to be poor because these people are inferior has been an undercurrent that has driven disinvestment in certain communities. So that's part of the community economic development question, but also the conversation about who should be seated at the tables of power and who should be given a voice and a level of authority to determine, right, who has access to housing versus who is exploited in the housing market. And so when we talk about AI, when we talk about tools that allow those who are developers, those who have the wealth and resources to speculate, these tools often perpetuate a cultural narrative that says if you are wealthy, it is justified for you to step into poor communities, build housing, and develop a community that from a cultural standpoint is inferior, right? This was the whole premise behind urban renewal and slum clearance, the idea that low-income folks of color just didn't know how to take advantage of the community, and so their social capital wasn't worth preserving because in most instances they didn't own the housing stock, and so they just could be removed. AI supercharges that and provides a mechanism for those who have the resources to engage in speculation and development, to target communities, to identify communities where there's a lack of home ownership, there's a high percentage of renters, and to engage in that speculation game, to utilize technology to manipulate the marketplace. And because individuals living in those low-income communities aren't granted the kind of housing rights from a human rights standpoint that Taisha was mentioning, they don't have resources, tools, or a voice to speak back against that. And so some of the work that I've done and research that I've written about on community economic development, I think is very much related to this housing question, because it pushes back against the notion that the answer to disinvestment, the answer to communities that are low income and lacking resources, is to bring in developers, bring in speculators, and provide them with tax incentives to sort of step into low income communities and to fix them up. I think the most progressive approaches to community development is to empower people in the community themselves. And I think similarly, when we think about what's happening in the digital space, what's happening via artificial intelligence, in my view, the way to push back against that is to think about what rights do people have to resist the kind of speculation that's targeting them, whether it's being able to bring claims of discrimination via the traditional mechanisms, the Fair Housing Act. And that's a little bit difficult, right, to prove when we're thinking about the elements of proving intentional discrimination via an algorithmic tool. And so there are some procedural questions and legal questions there that have yet to be resolved. But more fundamentally, the rights that community members have to resist speculation writ large that's being supercharged by these digital tools, things like community benefit agreements, the concept of opportunity zones in many ways perpetuates the narrative, but how could we reframe and reform a kind of opportunity zone model that might empower people living in the community to have a voice and a more meaningful stake in the development process, such that investment and speculation doesn't just lead to more displacement and gentrification. So I don't know if that's a real good answer to your question, but I think AI is just supercharging some of these issues we've seen across the generations, which is speculation, exploitation, using legal mechanisms, tax, right? And now technology is just taking it to the next level to dive into low-income communities of color where individuals lack rights, and to displace them and to take the land and to then, reap the value from it, which is part and parcel of the sort of American model of capital generation.
Yeah, I think you answered it just right. I mean, I think it ties directly into the title of today's conversation. That the quest continues, right? We know that these tactics and these practices are evolutionary; they're not static. What we saw in 1968, we're just seeing evolutionary tools. To your point, right? And it's our job to push back. And I want to be mindful of time, and I feel like this group we could have this conversation and brainstorming sessions for quite some time. But I do want to make sure that I close out. So, Catherine, I'll start with you. So, our title of tonight, and going to try to hold everyone to about 2 minutes, is 1968 continues, the quest for fair housing. The quest for fair housing continues. So, in 2 minutes or less, where would you like to see fair housing? If we convene 10 years from now, where would you like to see fair housing in our country?
First, I just want to say kudos to everybody's comments and the thoughtfulness. There are housing bills that are moving through the Senate. So the Rhodes Act just passed. The Senate is going to the House. That is a bill sponsored by Senator Warner, Elizabeth Warner, as well as Tim Scott. It's a bipartisan bill. So there's still movement in the housing market. But truth of the matter is, when we come out of this mess called the Trump administration, and we see what has been torn apart, we're going to have some very real honest conversations about how to put it back together again. And this includes how capital markets finance housing. I would love to see something like a national housing bank that has a guaranteed low interest loan solely for homeowners. I think we need to be thinking bigger and totally outside of the box, because at some point the rebuilding will need to be happening. It is comforting to see that a lot of the zoning modifications that are going to be needed on the local level are being discussed at the federal level. So we will hopefully see more housing types. But I suspect that we're also going to see a lot more manufactured housing. And what that means is you're not going to need as many construction workers. You're not going to need as many electricians to build the housing. So we need to be very thoughtful about what some of these changes actually mean. And then lastly, Professor Toussaint mentioned AI. We do need to be mindful of what AI is, because I fear that one day, because property management is so hard, that these buildings are going to be managed by an AI tool, not actually by people. And which means that you're going to be talking to a machine. And so not only are we going to have to look back to some of these historical issues that we created a framework in 1968, but we're going to have to be very dynamic in how we think about rebuilding the housing system in this country. When that great day comes, that we are in a position to make major changes, not only because what has been torn apart is pretty significant, but also what we're facing is a very new dynamic that we've never faced before. We don't know what Bitcoin is going to do. We don't know what these new kinds of monies are going to do to our market. And so we really need to, in technology, so we really need to make sure that we're adapting this conversation, not just to respond to kind of the things that we've talked about today, but what are those issues that we're going to be facing 10 years from now, which I would also say includes a real conversation around the demographic shift.
All right. Thais, 10 years from now, where would you like to see fair housing in our country?
10 years from now, ideally, I would love to see at a national level, we really do recognize housing as a human right, that we acknowledge and accept that we have to provide housing opportunities for everybody, that we are setting policies and programs and models that create a variety of different housing, so that people have choice. People have real choice in what type of housing they live in, where they live, what that housing looks like, what it affords them. And that means that we have to move past local, honestly, local control of zoning, which has been the real inhibiting factor in housing in a lot of ways. I mean, there are some progressive communities, but by and large, local zoning has been a huge inhibiting factor in actually creating innovative housing models and communities. And so we have to get to a place where there is a recognition of the role of what zoning can do in the housing space, and liberating zoning from local control that seeks to keep it in the 1950s single family, big homes, white picket fence vision of this country. The other thing that I'd love to see in this space is that we have a real recognition of the ways that the housing market has been used to prop up some folks and has been used to keep others down, and so that we have an opening up of opportunity. I know I didn't really get a lot of chance to talk about the BIPOC developers work, but we really do need to do a lot of work around creating opportunity for new and emerging developers, Black and brown developers, women developers, faith-based developers, nonprofit developers, to participate in building the communities that we want to see, because oftentimes it is when we have diversity in who is creating the communities, we have variety in what those communities look like and what those communities offer that speaks to the cultural needs of that community. So we need to really be investing. I'd love to see that we're investing more resources in supporting that and actually restructuring programs, models, approaches, underwriting standards to allow for that to happen. Right now, we are fighting against a framework and a thinking that is rooted in supporting experienced developers that are primarily and with old money. That model and framework does not work for newer emerging developers, and we have to be ready to think about new frameworks for how we support developers that are creating the housing that we need for the future. We need to be thinking about the regulatory framework for the housing of the future. And I hope that we really are having a national conversation about what it means to ensure the right to housing, protect it, and really enforce that at a national and local level.
Professor Toussaint, 10 years from now, where would you like to see fair housing?
Yeah, I think if we're headed in the right direction, 10 years from now, fair housing will be confronting the challenges and issues that the traditional framework wasn't designed to address. I think for too long, we've focused on fair housing as an issue of discrimination and enforcement. Someone discriminates, an individual act of malice, and there's a complaint and adjudicatory process, and that's important. There's been a lot of excellent litigation that has addressed intentional discrimination, but we haven't quite figured out a way to wrestle with the structural dimensions of racial discrimination, the disparate impacts of the marketplace on communities of color and low-income communities. And so certainly thinking about housing not as an affordability issue, but an issue of supply. And I think Catherine did an amazing job at referencing some of the innovative methods to address that: social housing, mixed income development, et cetera, cooperative housing, community land trust. I think additionally codifying affirmatively furthering fair housing in statute, so we don't see executive actions that diminish efforts that are happening at the state level to address segregation. We didn't talk about it much, but I have to mention it as a lawyer, funding a national right to counsel in eviction proceedings, right, which is so important. 90% of landlords in eviction courts have legal representation. 3% of tenants do. And so that obviously leads to a lot of situations where renters are not able to adequately represent themselves. And eviction is such a huge issue that we saw spike during the pandemic. Funding to scale community land trust, cooperative housing development that can push us to increasingly think about housing through a communitarian lens that I think can address some of the market-based issues that we've seen in recent decades. Certainly, as you alluded, treating algorithmic fairness as an important area of concern, and something that wasn't mentioned as much, climate displacement, right? As the climate continues to evolve, we see wealthier residents shifting into lower income areas and gentrifying those areas, right? Places like Miami and other coastal areas. How do we protect low income communities that are being poached due to changes in the climate? That's a fair housing issue as well. And there's certainly rulemaking in place now to try to address some of these algorithmic concerns. So seeing that come to fruition, but ultimately in 10 years, finding some solutions to these structural problems, determining structural remedies. Otherwise, I think the market is going to continue to reproduce the inequalities that law and policy created. So building an architecture that's durable, that can help us to realize the right to fair housing that Taisha talked about, and to supercharge some of the innovative frameworks that Catherine shared with us as well.
Well, I am extremely excited. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your evening to join me in this conversation. 1968 seems it seems like a short amount of time, and here we are still fighting the fight of finding ways to address fair housing. So we're only able to do this work because we have champions like you that have stayed into the field. It is not the most glamorous or wealthy of work, but we would not be where we are. And I think our forefathers would be extremely appreciative that the fact that you continue to lend your time, your talent, and your intellectual treasure into this great space. And we hope that we can continue to have conversations like this, think tanks, provocative ways of thinking, dynamic ways of challenging the system, so that we can be the generation that eliminates some of the issues that we see our communities face today. So I thank everybody that joined us this evening for this thoughtful conversation. I hope that you took away some gems, and we look forward to having this conversation again. Look out for the next installment from the Public Policy Committee of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, as we continue to have conversations like this. Thank you so much. Thank you.